Hello and welcome to today's podcast episode. My name is Marco Dinter, and as usual, I'll talk about the conservation work of the Frankfurt Zoological Society. Collecting and analyzing data is the core of science and the basis of our work. Getting and collecting data about wildlife and ecosystems can be a challenge because of area size, of animal behavior, and of course, a matter of resources. People cannot be everywhere at any time, so we need technical solutions supporting the research. And we need people who are able to put this equipment to use. One of them is my colleague Adam Smith, who is, by the way, quite good at yodeling. Let him explain how that is connected to conservation work. Adam is an expert for camera traps and works for the FZS Europe department. He already did quite some interesting camera trap surveys, for example, around the Chernobyl exclusion zone and in the Carpathians. And I'm very to have him here. Hi, Adam. How are you doing?
Hi, Marco. I'm doing very good. I'm very happy to be on the podcast with you.
Let's start with the basics. Where are you from and how did you end up at FZS?
So I'm from Ireland. I'm from a place not too far from Dublin. I got a job with FZS, which is also helping me towards my PhD through the University of Freiburg and the FZS Europe department, working on large mammals in Eastern Europe.
And you're working mainly with camera traps. What exactly is a camera trap and how do they work?
Yes, so we're working mainly with camera traps. Camera traps are a really cool piece of wildlife monitoring equipment. It's basically a camera trap. It's basically a camera that you place in the wild, in a forest, for example. And when an animal walks by the camera trap, it turns on and takes a photo or a video. So you get this really interesting data, a photo or a video with the time and the location, which is a really important piece of evidence, scientific evidence that we use to do studies with.
And do you get those pictures directly like at your computer or your phone, or do you need to gather them again?
There are some types of camera traps that can send photos or videos over mobile connection, but generally we work in wilderness areas. And so what we use are camera traps that save it to a small SD card. And then we go back into the field and collect them. We bring all the SD cards together from all the camera traps and load them onto the computer.
Okay, and why is that such an important tool? You said it's great, but I still need to find out why.
Sure. So camera traps are really important because they're a non-invasive monitoring method, which means that we don't have to interfere with the animals' lives. We can just place the camera in the forest, we can leave, and what we see then are the kind of natural behaviors of animals in these environments. They're also really powerful tools for doing statistical analysis. As I said before, you get this time and date, you get the GPS locations or the coordinates of where the camera trap is, and so you get this really nice data where you have the species of animal, where it is and when it was there. And with that, we can do all sorts of really cool analysis.
And what type of animals can it record? Like from which size?
Generally, it's from things that are small, but not too small, like a squirrel, for example, often will trigger a camera trap, but maybe a mouse would not. So anything bigger than a squirrel would trigger the camera trap. It normally detects heat and movement together. So smaller animals, they don't normally have such a big heat difference, but you will always get big animals like deer or wild boar activating camera traps because they're big, they're warm, and they, of course, moving in front of the camera will trigger it.
And where did you work with camera traps already?
So already I've worked in Ukraine, in the Polesia project. I've worked in Belarus in the Polesia project, and I've worked in the Carpathians with camera traps as well, also in Ukraine. As well as that, we have some projects with partners that are working in Poland and Slovakia. And then I have another project, a small side project in Ireland, where I deploy a number of camera traps just for a small study.
And on what species are you working in those areas?
I work mostly on the larger animals. So I work on the large carnivores, so wolves, bears, and Eurasian lynx. I also work a lot on their prey species, so red deer, roe deer, moose, wild boar, and sometimes foxes as well.
Mm-hmm. And where and how do you place those traps? Is it like a lot helps a lot, and are you just basically plastering the forest with traps, or are you following a certain system? Or
yeah, we do follow a certain system. We have a couple of different systems, actually, a couple of different protocols, depending on what way we want the data to look. We always say, even with these systems, the more camera traps, the better. So we're always asking for more camera traps. Sometimes not all the camera traps work. The batteries might die, or they might be buried in the snow, or they can also be stolen. So we try to use as many as possible, but we use them in certain designs for certain research questions. So generally, we want to know what animals are there, we want to know when they're there, and we want to know how many are there. So we have to position the cameras in a certain way that we can get more powerful statistics. For example, we place the cameras sometimes randomly, like without a human influence. We just generate random points on a map, and then we go to those locations. And that gives us a little bit more statistical power in terms of how we interpret the data that comes in.
so you literally just take a GPS and then you need to go to place XY and put the camera trap there. And
exactly.
Doesn't matter how the landscape is there, or
well, we have some things that we can take into account. For example, if we want to just put the camera traps in forests, then we would only use the forest XYs, the forest locations. As well as that, if the point falls maybe too close to a village or a settlement, we might decide to actually just redo that point somewhere else, because of the risk that somebody would steal the camera trap, or that we just don't want to, put a camera trap there and have people worrying, what is that camera doing in my part of the forest? But for other studies, we place the cameras more targeted towards certain species. For example, we have other types of protocols where we put the camera traps on roads or forest roads, and we put the camera traps on trails, like animal trails or hiking trails. So this increases the number of photos we get, but it also has a little bit of a bias, because some animals will avoid these locations and some animals are more attracted to them.
Mm-hmm. And does this system, or you said protocol, help you also compare your data from one area to the other? Like if you're working in Ukraine or somewhere else in the EU or whatever?
Yes, exactly. So when we have the camera traps randomly placed, we, for example, the rate of animals, so the number of animals that you see per camera trap per day, can be compared more closely to camera traps in other projects with the same setup. So we can do that in our Ukraine project, we can do it in Belarus, we can do it also in other projects that we are not directly involved in, but we maybe have colleagues who are doing it in Germany, for example. So this allows us to make really interesting comparisons across study sites, and it will often show some interesting results, such as higher density of deer species in one area, but maybe there are no large carnivores there. And then we have in FZS projects, we have a lot of near natural areas or wilderness areas. So our interpretation should be that possibly they are more natural systems, and this is what other protected areas should look for in terms of their management of their wildlife.
We talked a lot about wildlife now. Let's talk about humans for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
You said some of your cameras get stolen as well. Can you give us a number of how many are gone after one project? Or, I mean, if I would put a camera trap in the nearest forest here in Frankfurt, I would bet it would be gone in a day.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a problem with not just camera trapping, but any science where you leave equipment in areas where people go and it's unsupervised. We probably have lost maybe 5% of camera traps to people being stolen, to people stealing them. It's not any different to any other camera trap projects, as far as I'm aware. In general, you will always lose or break maybe 5 or 10% of your equipment per year or per study. I think it's just normal. It's also technology, so it breaks by itself. Sometimes the batteries don't work. Sometimes water gets in, or insects get in, or even animals can break them by biting them, for example. We try to make this to minimize any damage to camera traps or losses by putting the camera traps in these metal security boxes. We then lock the boxes with a padlock and a key, and then we use a chain or a steel cable to tie it around the tree. And so all of this locked together means it's a lot harder for somebody to take it. Of course, people can take it if they really want. They will come back with even a chainsaw and cut down the tree if they really want to take this camera trap. So you can only make it much harder for them, but you can't stop all losses of camera traps or any equipment, I think, in the field.
And what about the animals? Do they sometimes touch or harm the camera traps as well?
Yeah. For example, in Chernobyl, we had one time a wolf biting the camera trap, and he managed to pull the camera trap off the tree and break it. As well as that, and our recent study in Poland, we had a bison that decided it wanted to use the camera trap to scratch. And I don't think the camera trap broke, but it was not useful for the rest of the study because it was completely falling off the tree, and the bison was able to use its power and its strength to knock the camera trap from its position. So we got no more data from that camera trap. Just the last thing was the butt of the bison scratching.
So we're talking about bison, wolves, a lot of wild animals in the areas you put the camera traps. You also put them by yourself usually, don't you? Yeah.
Yeah, so we put them with, so we never go just by ourselves. It's always in teams, so a minimum of 2 people, I would say, every time. And we work really closely with the protected area staff to do that. We either go directly with the protected area staff. We have sometimes permission to go by ourselves with our FZS team to camera trap locations, but in general, it's with protected area staff such as rangers, scientific staff, or zoologists who are working with national parks, for example.
But isn't that still, or can it be dangerous? I mean, just 2 of you walking through a forest and then, I don't know, a bear or a wolf coming along, that seems a bit,
I think
dangerous, at least.
No, I think it's generally it's not actually dangerous. Animal attacks on people are just exceptionally rare. There's quite a lot of literature, especially about wolf attacks in the last few decades in Europe. And given the amount of wolves we have in Europe, much more than the United States, for example, and the density of people, wolves basically never attack people, or it's just so exceptionally rare. So the risk is really small. I think you're more likely to be in a car crash on the way to your study site than you are to even have a negative encounter with wildlife. But you should always still be careful. I mean, bears are maybe the most. Bears, wild boar can be a little bit aggressive if you come across them in the wrong circumstances, especially if they have babies with them, juvenile animals. So if you're walking in a location that you know there are bears, it's normally a good idea to talk a lot to each other while you're walking through the forest, to not be afraid to make a little bit of noise. You don't have to always go shouting in the forest, but I have one example or one story where we were coming down from a camera trap location and we knew there was bears in the area, and it was dark, and so we couldn't really see a lot, and that means we were going very slowly. And in that case, I was shouting into the forest a lot because I was just trying to make sure that the bears knew we were there and we didn't startle them, for example.
And what do you shout in those occasions?
You can shout whatever you want. If you're in a wilderness area, no one can hear you. So I think I was just, it was like a yodel, like I was in the Alps.
Nice. Okay. Let's come back to the technical parts of camera traps. The camera traps are not too smart, I assume. I mean, they will record any movement. Sometimes linked to heat. You already said that. But I assume you have, when you gather the SD cards, you have like thousands of pictures of, I don't know, branches moving in the wind, or I don't know, squirrels. Isn't that way too much work to go through all of them afterwards to find the photos you really need?
Yeah, it does. It does happen, especially, but it can be quite hard to predict. Generally, it's the vegetation on the ground that makes the most of these kind of empty photos, or photos of grass or vegetation moving. And it normally happens during the day. So the sun will shine onto that location, onto where the grass is, and it will make it a little bit warmer. And then the wind will move it left and right, for example. And this will cause, you could get 10,000 photos of just grass. The good thing is we don't really need to go through those one by one anymore. We have some artificial intelligence algorithms that we give the folder of images to, give the folder of images to the AI, and it will separate out animals and humans and the things we're interested in from the blank photos, and it will allow us to really easily delete the blank photos so that we're not spending hours and hours going through just photos of grass. But it doesn't happen on every occasion. It's maybe more, maybe 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 camera traps.
And I assume you already have enough experience to avoid that as well by just the placing of the camera trap.
Yeah. So it can depend also on the time of year. It's a lot more common in the summer, for example. But yeah, we try to put the camera traps at kind of a standard height on the tree, so about 50 centimeters. And if there's a lot of vegetation there, we will try and just move the camera a little bit, or maybe go to the next tree where it's a little bit more open. And in rare occasions where you don't really have much choice of where to put the camera trap, sometimes we remove a bit of vegetation, so just a little bit of grass or some branches that are really sticking across the front of the camera trap. But again, that's not too common for us because we don't want to influence the environment too much in that location.
And how long does it take you to analyze data? You said the AI is pre-sorting the photos, but still you have a lot of pictures of maybe not your target species, right?
Yeah, so it takes a long time because what we try to do is we try to make sure that the data set is complete. So we try and classify the images for everything. So we try, even if it's squirrels, whether it's a squirrel or a moose, we try and go through the photo and classify it. What we do that manually now because it's still, for the Europe department, it's still something that we're just only started a few years ago, and we maybe don't have enough data to train our own AI algorithm to classify the photos to species level. So maybe some of the other AIs that are out there would classify some of the animals correctly, but For us, we have in some study areas 5 species of ungulates, and that's quite rare in Europe. And so other AI algorithms might struggle a little bit with our species. So for the moment, we're still doing it manually, and it takes quite a long time, especially the longer your study goes on, the more photos you generate and the more camera traps you have, which is what you want. You want all of these things, but it generates a lot of photos, and then it means you have to be very patient with yourself tagging photos, your volunteers, interns, or colleagues who are tagging photos. So it takes a little bit of time, a little bit of patience, but there's not one number of or one time frame for tagging photos. It's just the more photos you have, the more time it will take.
And what happens with that data eventually? What are the results you can tell us about your studies, maybe?
So we use that data at the end. We get this table of our species, our times, our dates, and our locations. And with that, we can do kind of our more statistical analysis. We can look at some ecological effects of species. We can look at the different habitats that they use and in what proportion. One of the things that we're looking at a lot is the density of animals, or the animals per unit area. So, for example, per square kilometer. This is really interesting because it's really influenced by a number of factors. It's influenced by human pressure, such as hunting. It's influenced by the predator pressure on different species, and it's influenced by the habitat. And so density is one thing we're looking at a lot. We're looking at it for both ungulates and Eurasian lynx as well.
And how high is the density, for example, for Eurasian lynx? Like, can we say how they are spreading across Germany or whatever?
Well, so we've looked at our study sites in Ukraine and Belarus, and we've done one season of lynx surveys that have been analyzed, and well, we can say that the density is low, but it's relatively similar to other densities in Europe. So for us, that's important because it's the first time somebody has used camera traps to do this kind of spatial capture recapture, we call it, of lynx in Ukraine and Belarus. So it's important results to see that there are some differences between the study sites. For example, in Belarus, our study site is very much a wetland area with some forests, and that has the lowest density of lynx. And it's something that we maybe expected, but now that the results are there, we can say for certain that there are lynx in that area, of course, but the density is relatively low. So that was really interesting for us.
Capture recapture is quite a common method in population density to estimate population density. Can you explain that briefly for our listeners, maybe?
Yeah, so the way it works with our camera traps is that we set 2 camera traps on a road or a trail, which are really often frequented by lynx. And what this gives us is hopefully 2 nice photos of the lynx, one from the left side and one from the right side. And one of the really cool things about Eurasian lynx is that they have a unique spot pattern for each individual animal, like a human fingerprint. So we can use that to identify individuals. And then we can, when we have our camera traps spread across the landscape, we can recapture those individuals at different locations and different times. So what we get is a data set where you have lots of individuals who are captured multiple times. You have some individuals who are captured less often, and then you have some individuals who are captured maybe just one time, or maybe even just one side of their body. And we have some nice and powerful statistical frameworks with spatial capture recapture now that allow us to turn those individuals and those detections into a number of animals per square kilometer.
And you're generating a lot of data in your project.
Mm-hmm.
Who owns that data eventually? How do you work with your local partners, for example?
So it's always a little bit complicated. I think it's different in every place. A lot of the time we make data sharing agreements that, we can go to a protected area. We can use our camera traps and collect this information with the help of our colleagues who work for that protected area. And we say that they can use the data if they would like to, and we will use the data. Primarily, it's us, because we have researchers whose kind of primary task is to use that data. But our data is shared, so it's shared between national parks, it's shared between nature reserves. They have access to the photos, they have access to the final data sets, and quite often as well, kind of starting now and into the future, they have opportunity to join us on scientific publications, for example, to read through our results, read through how we discuss the results, and offer their comments and insights, which, in my opinion, is really, really important. I'm obviously not from Eastern Europe, and I've only been working in Eastern Europe for a few years, so I really value the input of my colleagues, which, I've learned a lot from them already. But there's always something that, for me, I have a slightly different perspective, and I think having their perspective on the ground more often than me, and working in these areas for a lot longer, is really interesting to have, and it's really valuable.
And you use your expertise in camera traps also for other stuff. I mean, that's your work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Using camera traps basically all day. But now I heard you can't get enough of them still, and already put them up in your free time in your home country. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about learning these kind of methodologies once, or having this really nice experience, is that it makes it quite easy and fast to do it again. So I think for the first camera trap study that we planned, it took us at least a few weeks or a few months to even have a plan for the study. And then, in 2021, I had some holiday time, and I was talking to one of my supervisors who was actually working in Dublin, and he also supervised my master thesis. And we were talking about, maybe we should also start a new camera trap project in Ireland, because there is no camera trap projects in Ireland, not in wild places, or not publishing scientific data. So we made a quick agreement together that I would take a week of holiday time, of vacation time, and set up some camera traps. And it turned out to be really, really successful. And it was already the biggest kind of and first published camera trap study in kind of the wild of Ireland. And in 2022, we repeated it again, but we doubled the size. And we also got local volunteers involved. Local nature groups were involved and are still involved in classifying the photos. And it was really great, because I took all the experience I had in Ukraine, for example, training rangers how to use camera traps, and how to put them in the correct locations. And I took that, which took me a long time to get right in Ukraine, and I did it in one day in Ireland, which was really fun. So I think things like that will continue. I hope to do a lot more camera trapping in Ukraine in the future, but I think I will also be really useful to colleagues who are just starting camera trap projects anywhere now. So for me, it's too much fun to be outside. It's too much fun to collect camera traps. At the end, you have thousands and thousands of photos of animals. It's like a dream come true for a wildlife biologist.
It really sounds like a lot of fun, but of course it has a serious background as well.
Mm-hmm.
So in the end of the day, what's in it for conservation? How can we use that data? How can we use those results you were creating to conserve nature, to conserve wilderness?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different things you can do. Since we just touched on communities and also training people, camera traps provide really nice visual resources, visual media that you can use to capture people's attention and imagination, which is something that most other data collection methods don't really have. So that's one thing that's really useful. It's useful for communication. It's really useful in terms of comparing and contrasting different protected areas or even protected areas with areas that are not protected, and looking at the different influences of humans on nature, on the density of animals, but also on the behaviors, how they interact with each other. And, when we're talking about conservation, we're not just talking about, drawing a border on a map and saying this area is now protected. We're also trying to protect the processes and how the ecology of that system works. So that also includes how species interact with each other, how wolves and deer, how deer and forests interact and regrowing forests. So it's kind of a multi-level approach, and I think camera traps for that are really useful because we can do a lot with them. And they, as I said before, they collect data kind of in a non-invasive way. We don't have to stand 100 people in the forest for hours and hours and hours to observe animals. We can put 100 camera traps instead and make some really powerful inferences and collect some really interesting evidence of how effective our conservation measures are or are not. Especially if we have things like management interventions. We stop hunting in an area. What happens? What changes? Or we need to start hunting in an area because there's overgrazing or overbrowsing by deer because maybe there is no large carnivores. So it's a really useful tool in that regard.
And super interesting work you do. Thank you very much for that interview, Adam.
Sure. Thank you so much.